Hello, everyone. My name is Kudokwa Foya, and I'm in Zimbabwe. Today, I'll be conducting a brief discussion on ethical decision making in AI-enhanced classrooms, specifically focusing on how to empower students and educators, right, with critical thinking skills. So, I'd just like to give you a brief outline of what I'll be discussing today. So, the first thing, I'd like to look at the definition of terms, right, for us to understand exactly what are ethics, even though sometimes it's a bit of much of a contested field. And then what is the AI within the educational field? And then what is critical thinking? Then we would also like to establish the theoretical frameworks that are going to govern this discussion. We're going to look at utilitarianism, deontology, value ethics, and the ethics of care. And then finally, the humanistic ethical theoretical contribution. Then from there, also looking at the theoretical frameworks as basis for decision making. And then we're also going to look at certain case studies that inform the whole discussion. From there, so the first thing, what are ethics? First and foremost, it is important for us to establish one important fact, that ethics are not bound to any particular academic discipline. They are rather adapted into different fields and disciplines. Ethics, I would like to quote J. Torsellis, who says that ethics are concerned with what it is to live a flourishing life and what it is we morally owe to others. Within this definition, we uncover very important tenets of ethics. The first one is the individual well-being, and then the second one is the obligations that we owe to others and the rights that they hold against us. So these balancing tenets of ethics have provided regulations on innovations, disciplines, and propositions. Therefore, ethics are important because they provide tools to us to determine whether or not we should do certain things, certain actions, and the implications they might have on people. So now let's define ethics. Ethics are not bound by a particular discipline. Rather, they're substantiated by different disciplines. So I'd like to quote J. Torsellis at this point. He said that ethics are concerned with what it is to live a flourishing life and what it is we morally owe to others. This definition gives us very important tenets to ethics. The first one being what we owe ourselves as individuals in terms of our well-being. It also brings out the obligations we owe to others and the rights that they have and that they can hold against us. So these balancing tenets of ethics are provided as regulations for a lot of innovations, disciplines, and propositions. Ethics provide us with tools to determine whether or not we should do certain things. And then it is also important to note that ethics are not descriptive, in that they do not study what people do or how they're supposed to do things, or rather how people act. Rather, ethics, in this case, they prescribe what ought to be done and what is not supposed to be done. Now let's look at AI. What is really AI within the educational field? AI simply and generally is the simulation of human intelligence. This is usually possessed by machines, right? Particularly computer systems. So in education, AI technologies are used to automate administrative tasks, to personalize learning experiences for students, and to provide intelligent tutoring systems. So now let's look at some of the examples of AI in classrooms. We have Khan Academy, we have Duolingo, we have Turnitin, and we have Carnegie Learning as Mika. So now let's look at critical thinking skills. What really are critical thinking skills? So critical thinking skills, I would like to quote Dali 1998 and Dewey 1916. They basically say that critical thinking is generally considered as a subset of the reflective processes that helps individuals make sound judgments, because this involves thorough assessment, scrutiny of information before arriving at conclusions. Therefore, the most important tenets that are reflected within this particular decision, or rather this definition, is reflective processes, making sound decisions through assessment and before arriving at a particular conclusion. Critical thinkers are usually associated with problem solving. And in a world where AI is dominating, critical thinking skills are really, really important in creating a balance on what needs to be done and how it should be done. And in also regulating the learning processes of young people. So critical thinking skills are also useful to analyze complex data, to evaluate situations and actions, and to implement the most appropriate action. Hence, it's a must-have skill. All right. So as we move on, we move now to establishing the theoretical framework. So we have interesting theories. The first theory is utilitarianism. So this particular theory mainly focuses on determining what is right from wrong, basically, by focusing on outcomes. This therefore means that if the outcomes of a particular innovative structure has greater positive attributes than negative attributes, it's much more acceptable. So, however, utilitarianism cannot really predict the future because it's difficult to predict the future. Rather, we don't know with certainty what the consequences of certain actions will be, because some of the consequences are revealed in the future. So utilitarianism also has a trouble accounting for values such as justice, individual rights, for example. Then we move to deontology. So deontology basically uses rules to distinguish what is right from wrong. So deontology is often associated with a philosopher called Immanuel Kant. Kant believed that ethical actions follow universal moral laws such as don't lie and do not steal. Then we have value ethics. Value ethics are much more associated with philosophers like Aristotle, who emphasized the importance of moral character traits in informing decisions. So in the context of AI-enhanced classrooms, cultivating virtues such as empathy, integrity, and accountability among educators and students can guide ethical decision-making. This perspective encourages individuals to embody ethical values and to act in accordance with virtuous principles in their interactions with AI technologies. And then of ethics of care. The ethics of care, they're championed by feminist philosophers like Carol Gilligan, emphasizes the importance of relationships, empathy, and compassion in ethical decision-making. This perspective highlights the need to continue the unique needs and perspectives of all stakeholders involved in AI-enhanced education, including students, educators, and parents. Educators adopting an ethics of care approach may prioritize building trust relationships with their students and fostering a supportive learning environment for their well-being. Now we'll move on to AI within the educational field. So what is AI? AI basically refers to any human intelligent processes that are simulated in machines and applications. There are different types of AI systems that we have within the educational space of Duolingo, with the Khan Academy, and with Turnitin. And then what are the benefits of AI in education? The first one is efficiency in grading and feedback. AI is quite efficient in grading, and this saves time for a lot of teachers. Secondly, personalized learning experiences. AI algorithms can analyze student data and come up with personalized student plans, etc. And then have access to vast amount of educational resources. This therefore leads to specific recommendation systems for students on the information that they need. And then improved student engagement. AI-enhanced education tools often incorporate gamification elements, and these interactive features that make it easier for students to interact more with their teachers. And then what are the ethical challenges of AI in education? The first one is bias in algorithms. So algorithms, they basically function like this. If they're fed with a lot of information, they reflect the information that they've been fed with. Therefore, that later on creates a lot of biases. Gebru in 2018 basically says that there's gender biases sometimes in AI-powered tools. And then we have privacy concerns. AI systems in education often collect and analyze large amounts of information and centralize that information. So there's the risk of that information being taken by people and being used. And then we have Strueda, J in 2019, basically brings out that AI systems in education often collect and analyze large amounts of student data, raising concerns about privacy and data security. And then if dependence on technology. So over-reliance on AI systems, they can diminish the educator's autonomy and decision-making capabilities. And by extension, this could also affect the quality of learning and critical skills development within students. And then I think with also threats to the teacher's autonomy. Here in this case, teachers will be regimented by AI tools, which later on affects flexibility within the classroom. And then what are some of the importance, or rather what is the importance of ethical decision-making? So the first thing, ethical decision-making is essential for ensuring that technologies in education promote fairness, transparency, and student well-being. Then also we have ethical AI fosters a positive learning environment where students feel valued, validated, respected, and where they can interact fully with their teachers. And then also educators can play a critical role in guiding students' interactions with AI technologies if they're aware of the ethical considerations in using AI. Building ethical awareness. There are several strategies you can implement for educators and for learners to learn more about ethics in AI. The first strategy is incorporating AI discussions within curriculums and classroom activities, therefore creating a systematic way and approach of seeing and assimilating ethics within AI. And then providing training and professional development opportunities for educators on ethical AI use, and then encouraging students to critically evaluate the ethical implications of AI technologies in activities that include class debates, case studies, and research projects. Now we seek to establish a theoretical framework for ethics in AI. The first one is the utilitarianism ethical contribution, which basically looks into determining what is right from what is wrong, by mainly focusing on the outcomes. This idea holds that the most ethical idea or ethical choice is the one that will produce the greatest good for the greatest number. However, there's a limitation to this theoretical contribution because utilitarianism, or anyone basically, cannot adequately predict the future. Therefore, it is very difficult to know with certainty whether the consequences of a certain choice will be good or bad. And then utilitarianism also has trouble accounting for values such as justice and individual rights. Then we have deontology. Deontology basically says that it uses rules to distinguish right from wrong. Therefore, deontology basically aligns itself with rules within the educational system on whether or not AI can be used in certain spaces. The main proposition for deontology is Immanuel Kant, and he basically says that ethical actions, they're supposed to follow a moral universal law or moral universal laws, and such as, for example, don't lie, don't steal. And then we have the value ethics contribution. This one is associated with philosophers like Aristotle. He emphasizes the development of a moral choice, like traits, virtues, on how to lead ethical behavior. In the context of AI-enhanced classrooms, cultivating virtues such as empathy, integrity, collaboration, accountability among educators and students can guide in ethical decision-making. This perspective encourages individuals to embody these values in accordance with the virtuous principles, the interactions with AI technologies. And then we have, lastly, ethics of care. The ethics of care is championed by feminist philosophers like Carol Gilligan, emphasizing the importance of relationships, empathy and compassion in ethical decision-making. This perspective highlights the need to consider the unique needs and perspectives of all students and stakeholders involved in AI-enhanced classrooms, including students, educators, and parents. Educators adopting an ethics of care approach may prioritize building trust with their students and fostering a supportive learning environment. We'll move on to case studies and real-life examples of ethical dilemmas that are associated with AI-enhanced classrooms. The first one is biases in AI-driven grading algorithms, which lead to disparities in students' outcomes. A study in 2021 reported by an education software solution provider saw a predictive algorithm bias against Guatemalan students. This is because the original data used to train the system had very few Guamanian students, which is later on fixed by resampling the data and retraining the algorithm. The next example has to do with privacy concerns related to the collection and the use of student data by AI-powered learning platforms. An example of this was reported by EdSearch on an AI podcast in 2022. A high school student named Bill hacked into his Massachusetts school district's communication systems, accessing millions of student records, including grades, immunization records, lunch orders. The system that was used here is called Blackboard and Follett, which again was a system that was widely used in schools across the country. And then the third example has to do with dependence on AI tutors, limiting students' critical and problem-solving skills. A lot of research is going into substantiating this claim that the more students lean on AI tutors, the less they develop their critical thinking skills because of various reasons. First, being isolated from collaborating and creating with their peers in the classroom. So now we'll move on to the educator's role in ethical AI use. So the first thing is we need to establish the importance of educator training in AI ethics. Educators should receive training on ethical use, including understanding biases in algorithms and protecting student privacy and promoting inclusivity. Secondly, we also need to implement ethical guidelines and policies within educational institutions. Schools and educational organizations should establish clear guidelines and policies for the responsible use of AI technologies, including protocols for privacy and data security. Then fostering a culture of ethical decision-making among staff and students. This is meant to encourage open communication and collaboration among educators, administrators, students, and parents to address any ethical concerns that promote ethical behavior in the classroom. Now we'll move on to critical thinking. I think it's important first to establish what critical thinking is. So critical thinking is basically considered as a subset of reflective processes that helps individual make sound judgments because it involves thorough assessment and scrutiny of information before arriving at a conscious conclusion. This is a definition that was provided by Daly and Dewey in 1998. Critical thinking helps the individual to develop and check one's own assumptions and those of others. Paul 1993 also adds on. Therefore, critical thinking skills, they are very useful in analyzing complex data sets that are provided by AI and to also evaluate situations and actions and implement most appropriate actions. Hence, it is a must to have the skills within the AI-powered classrooms. Development and facilitation of critical thinking skills. How do you develop critical thinking skills among students in AI-enhanced classrooms? I have a few ways. The first one is the teaching approaches that are used by teachers. Teachers are supposed to require students to play an active role in their learning processes. This means that there is much more involvement by the students as opposed to didactic teaching practices. Simpson and Courtney 2002 postulate this. And then the second strategy would be having a much more problem-based learning environment where a lot of activities like writing reflective journals, role-playing, concept mapping, community mapping, and debates are reported or rather encouraged. Simpson, Courtney, and Velde 2006 emphasized this. They also say that these strategies are important as the students will be learning actively, thereby having critical thinking dispositions. And then with Klassen and Bonk also postulating another strategy. They basically said that there are many strategies that we can use to train and to help students to develop their critical thinking skills, but the most important of all are the questions that the teachers ask the students. High-level cognitive questions, they will require learners to manipulate information to create and support responses, while low-level cognitive questions are answered through recall, recognition, regurgitation, and simple application of information. Thank you so much.